I think I've been named the host, but I'm very much feeling this to be a conversation between you two. Sort of, that's what I'm sensing. And I think maybe I'm more in the crow's nest for this one and just kind of playing the role of a third that can maybe reflect some things back. And so, yeah, I think maybe if you guys want to get into it, Simon, you could very much set the primary frame and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, that sounds great, because what I think I'll do is set a little bit of the framing why we have the conversation. And then I think I'll pass it to Layman, because he recently wrote quite extensively on the topic of meta-shamanism and sort of different practices around that. And then I think we can zoom in on some parts that you laid out there. How does that sound?
Fabulous.
Perfect. Okay. Well, then I guess I'll start us off. So, yeah, I think we're gathered here to discuss a topic that is very dear to me and something that I've been dabbling in over the past couple of years, shamanic practice. But shamanic practice is a very broad concept, as we will probably get into in this meeting. And a while ago, I had a conversation with Layman on the topic, and also on some specifics on, doing shamanic practice also with clients, and kind of what kind of dynamics can sneak in there, and how to, walk that terrain with integrity, and also with specific focus for the space of doubt in that kind of space. And that certainty is maybe something that is actually something to be very cautious with, specifically when we enter these kind of strange atmospheres. And another reason that prompted this conversation is that Layman has been writing on the topic of shamanism, I think, for, probably more than a decade. Well, at least since I've been reading his work. And recently he dropped what I would consider a perfect primer on his Substack about meta-shamanic practice and, what is the modern shaman like? And it really points to the question of, like, what is the role of shamanism in the 21st century? And what does it actually look like? And so I would like to take this conversation to see if we can go into, I think, a bit of a broad sense, like what is it for, what is it like, but also see if we can dip into some particulars and like some specifics. And let's see how that goes. So I wanted to pass it on to Layman there.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of a word, shaman. You know, we could use any number of different words, but this one has a lot of cultural resonance for people, and it points to a type of subtle and esoteric and spiritual practice that's notably of service to building human tribes, notably ecological in its orientation, and notably enfolds a lot of subconscious and liminal elements of human intelligence. So I think one of the things we're looking at is not just how we would continue shamanic lineages that we inherit in different kinds of practices and worldviews, although that's important, but how we expand the practice for a planetary and transcultural environment, and for the types of ontologies, the types of sciences we have today, and for the I think the notion of reality that's emerging at the sort of cultural and scientific and philosophical leading edge of the global village is notably shamanic, if we allow ourselves to use that kind of a lens, right? There's a certain, like, 4E cognitive science is embodied and embedded and extended and enacted. And you're like, okay, so the psyche is my body, but it's also out there. It's also has to do with the imaginal constellations of my engagements with things in the world. And my psyche is pluralistic, is what a lot of our neuropsychology is telling us now. So it's more like a an interactive gathering of spirits, however we imagine that, than it is like a fixed, rational individual. So I think there are a lot of ways in which the set of problems that we think of as the polycrisis or the meta crisis could only really be addressed by re-empowering a kind of legitimate planetary scale shamanic practice and worldview and neurogenetic categories. There's a lot of caveats to all of that. There's a lot of different directions we could go down. Where would you like to go with that stuff?
Yeah, excellent. I'm gonna feel a little bit into where I'm being pulled. I like the idea that the shaman, or the role of the shaman, is can be a ritualist or a mediator. But the word traveler also comes up, like a someone who creates a certain space where how you describe how the psyche functions is less of an individualized psyche, and that we can cross boundaries, or let's say self-imposed boundaries. And then often I come into the image of how multicellular life works. How does an individual cell know it's part of a organ, and how does an organ know it's part of a body? And I often perceive the human as aggregate, already having difficulty understanding that it's part of a species, or at least of an organism, and by now a planetary scale organism. And I would be I'm mostly very interested in the role of the shaman in the potential recontextualization of the individual, but also of the group, of the tribe that they take care of. And that tribe is, of course, also malleable in the sense of like, maybe the shaman is like a molecule on the membrane, or I have to think, I'm feeling into what is a good analogy here, but something that is also in tune with a larger gestalt, and that can aid the tribe in different states to become aware of that larger organismal field, and that alignment can take place in that sense. And these can be, of course, in many different scales. We can have alignment on a community level, or alignment on a bioregional level, alignment on a planetary level, but maybe alignment on a cosmic level. And then maybe the shaman comes in more as the pre-religious archetype, like a pre-priest, but maybe also religious in that sense. I don't know what it looks like for the 21st century. And I see it just emerge. And I also want to, of course, pay homage or honor that there are active lineages of practicing shamans, mostly in the global south. We also in other places and regions of the world that have this lineage that goes back. But if I look at us three, well, we look like we're all from Western European descent, and there's been a rupture, I think, in that transference of lineage. And if I talk about myself, I think I'm thoroughly inoculated, or you could also call it contaminated, or with a sort of framing from a certain culture that seems to be almost like anathema to what I feel is shamanic practice. So being very down into the materialist science and that framing. And I'm ever interested also in the process of how are scientific paradigms shifting within culture and within the sciences. And in particular also biological science, because that is my background. So I'm feeling a bit into that direction. And I think what I already want to drop in as well, which came up in reading Layman's article, is he was making a description of a certain type of person that is drawn to shamanic practice, or what kind of modern practices are shamanic, or what he would consider shamanic. And I found the science fiction writer as one of them. And for me, that was evocative and right on the mark, as I felt like, yeah, it's the seeing of patterns and then crafting down into stories, because not everybody has the time to read the dry analytical theorizing of systems science, systems theory. But a good science fiction writer reads those things and then crafts a story or a myth which has all these elements in it and is powerful enough to transmit that information about how systems of power work, or how other species intelligences function, or all these can be powerful portals to step into other framings. So I'm also interested in expanding the concept of what is shamanic practice actually, and how many shamans do we have already walking around, even in sort of modern secular or maybe sort of spiritual but not religious culture. So that is a bit where I'm going currently.
Yeah, I like that you invoke biology. A lot of people are paying attention to Michael Levin's work lately, and this notion of how we persuade and orchestrate the multiplicity of living systems that can then form and be part of a larger system of some kind. And there's a question like, how do cells know they're part of an organ? Well, they don't know it. They don't know it the way we consciously know knowledge, but they might be able to encounter spectral impressions that communicate that realm to them. Or, I think this is quite important, they might be able to be resonant with the larger scales of organizational coherence when they feel like they are operating in a liminal or an in-between function, right? So that these two cells or organs or individuals feel like they're independent and separate. But if you can enter that sort of blurry space, which is going to be a little bit off-putting, a little disconcerting, a little nebulous, then you can be aligned to something that includes both of those. And that includes a certain tolerance for the peculiar and the strange. It includes a certain predilection to be drawn into threshold conditions and in-betweens and juxtapositions. And we see that a certain percentage of human beings have always exhibited a high level of interest in these conditions. And we could say that everybody has some level of interest in these conditions. But if you look at a lot of tribes, it seems very natural that periodically there's some people who like to be at the edge of the village. They like to be between the human and the ecological. They like to go to the edge of the cliff. They like to investigate what happens between waking and sleeping. They like to play with sense-making styles that move back and forth between what we call right brain and left brain, things like that. And because this tendency is and can be of use to human communities, my sense is that there's a kind of evolutionary conserving through both tradition and through neurobiology of people who have this type, right? Or maybe it's a range of types. We want to hold these ideas pretty loosely. But there's a question, there's a term, shamanoid, right? A shamanoid points not to somebody who's been trained as a shaman in a lineage, but it points to the kind of person who would be a good candidate for such training, or out of the pool of such people, traditions could have been engendered throughout history and in various times and places. Right? We can assume that maybe this is a neurogenetic type of some kind, or a disposition where people have a more than normal level of interest in certain kinds of stimulation, certain kinds of intelligence styles, certain kinds of experiences, where it seems to them as if a kind of a multi-dimensional curriculum is being unfolded out of themselves by being in conditions of boundary, of in-betweenness. And as much as we can say that these people were the normal esoteric or religious or wisdom agents throughout most of human history, which is to say, 10, 20, 30, 100. We don't know how long it is, but most of human history took place before cities and writing. So the normal form of human esoteric practice takes place in village, takes place in wilderness, takes place in tribe, something like that. Now, probably a great number of the wisdom traditions and religions as we think of them occurring in the last few thousand years have drawn upon these people, but they've also had the opportunity to draw upon other types of people, people who are believers or bureaucrats, or who will espouse the dogma of a faith that was written in a book. And you don't necessarily need people who are organically drawn to that kind of activity, although probably you should be looking for those people. Now we're at a point in history where not only are we encountering things that operate outside of individual cultural and lineage pools, we're also at a situation where the global village, so to speak, doesn't look like it's being stabilized in a sacred way, that its mental health and its depth and its ability to be aligned with nature. I love that you use that phrase, because we talk about with AI this alignment problem. I mean, is it going to be good for authentic, existential, human, and ecological thriving and well-being? But there are all these other versions of the alignment problem that go all the way back through human history, which is, are we thinking and feeling and operating together and building collectively in ways that are aligned with existential and ecological thriving and well-being? The question of the science fiction writer is a really interesting one. Right. I think one of the common ways to think about the shaman is a sort of upstream archetypal figure from prehistory, of whom many contemporary roles and specializations and disciplines have emerged. Right. We might say that the psychotherapist and certain forms of artists and a lot of our mystics and our poets are maybe downstream of what used to be a single type of character or role in the village. And we can continue that looking forward and say, who's doing things like we would associate with these ancient characters? Well, what are the things that they're into? Yes, thresholds, entheogens, ritual production, contemplative practice, sure, but also imaginal worlds. Also, the richness of transhuman organic intelligences and complexities. So if you go to a film as an adult or a child and you're like, oh, this is very interesting, this is a whole set of vivid imaginal worlds that I'm being invited to commune with, and each one is populated by bizarre sets of human and non-human creatures and intelligences that evoke some kind of not only cosmic majesty, but a sense that I should be using my attention and my sensation in very particular ways to unlock aspects of my own subconscious, such that I could thrive in a domain that feels cosmic, imaginal, and populated by a vast variety of strange intelligences. So I think that's something that the science fiction author, among the other kinds of genres that descend from the shaman, that the science fiction author has in common with people going all the way back. Right? You may have had a fairly, well, we don't really know how narrow the conceptual notion of other worlds was for people in tribes 30,000 years ago, right? It might have been very narrowly grounded. It might have been extraordinary. But there's something about the reaching for those worlds and the implication of the skill sets that are necessary to inhabit those worlds, and the ethical responsibility of understanding that the skill sets that are connected with the multiplicity of worlds are important to creating shared, sacred, reliable, coherent civic culture today. Right. So, like, how do we re-access those skill sets? Yes, we have to draw on existing lineages, but we also have to have a bigger picture about how these lineages get generated in the first place and how they sort of are adaptively mutated to different environments and time periods.
I was just recalling sort of, I don't know what age it would have been, but just a period in my youth where just that extreme sensitivity to imaginal worlds. And if someone starts telling a story, you very much enter into it and you're kind of at the whim of the energies that are encoded in that structure. And that kind of that feels like maybe the magical consciousness, thinking about Gibbs's work. And I feel like the shaman in many ways has its center of gravity in the archaic and the magic. But a question that's been kind of arising for me as I'm listening, and I wasn't aware of your article, Layman, so I apologize if I'm repeating anything that's already in there, but sort of I'm feeling the stream through history of this role as you were describing, and it was sort of this particular form for a very long time, and then it differentiated maybe quite recently. And I'm wondering, like, is the meta shaman the reintegration from that differentiation of these different kind of instantiations into something that now has a kind of more facets to the toolkit that it's able to work with? And is shaman actually the right kind of name for the meta spiritual faculty because it was the kind of oldest and most grounded? And maybe that coupled with like the need for re-enchantment and the kind of magical structure, like maybe that being the primary consciousness that is kind of lost and causing the mythic to fracture in the way that it is. So yeah, I'm curious. Oh, sorry, about the role of these other roles and like what makes the shaman meta, and like why focus on that as the meta lens.
Yeah, meta is a troublesome prefix in general, but it points to a couple of interesting things. I think what it adds to a discussion around the shaman is that we are interested not merely in people who identify with or who perform an existing social function with that role. We're also interested in the variety of that role, how those roles come to exist in the first place, how lineages are generated or regenerated, and how they operate in the kind of world that we're looking at now, which is multi-perspectival, transcultural, and for a lot of people engaged in a response to the meta crisis, to some kind of existential multiple set of multi-scale crises that may put everything we know of about humanity and nature at risk somehow. So that's a way of thinking about it as meta. We're also looking at a different body of cultural knowledge, right? We have a different technological and social and scientific view of the world than we think our ancient ancestors had. We don't want to rush to judgment or foreclose the richness of what their best thinkers might have been capable of. But this is not sort of purely a notion of return, right? If we think about things on a developmental hierarchy, that there's some kind of Gebserian magical realm, yes, that's very basic in us. It's very basic in everyone at some point in their lives. This is not about a return to that so much as the recovery of skills that might have been abandoned as we moved on from that level, but also the continuation of basic typologies that may have been present at that level in a certain flavor, but also present at the next sets of world spaces that emerge as well. Right? If we think about, many people would identify somebody like Carl Jung as a sort of modern shaman figure, right? It does a lot of the same things that we would attribute to the archaic shaman, and in fact re-invokes a lot of the archaic feelings and sensibilities, but doesn't return to that mode of living or the sort of narrow set of parameters that define their worldview, so to speak. So what does it look like given our current knowledge base? How do we take the people who would have undergone shamanic training in magical cultures and help them to serve many things about our contemporary system, including its re-enchantment? Right? I think one of the interesting things about re-enchantment that is interesting to explore is the role of ordeal of various kinds, right? We very often have this romantic notion that there used to be a lovely enchanted universe and somehow Western modernity was dropped on top of that. And we could get back to it if we just believed in fairies and angels and made things look pretty again. And maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, but the ancient village life was a dark and difficult one in many respects, right? It wasn't soft and cozy, even though it was very natural, very powerful in a lot of ways. There was a proximity to the strange, to the nonlinear, to the disrupted, to death, to the fertility of the earth, to the deadliness of creatures. There was a constant exposure to the transitions and intensities of nature, and the kinds of really effective culture producing religious practices that those early shamanoids came up with for their communities frequently involved short, intense stresses or disorientations of various kinds, right? And sometimes that could look like, well, we're going to string the young men up on hooks to get them ready to be warriors. And sometimes it looks like eat this mushroom and go out into the woods. But maybe it just looks like we wander up to a really creepy place a couple times a year, right at dusk, and let it get dark and let ourselves get tripped out. There's an element of disturbance and of the feeling that you might be confronting the monstrous, and an element of psychophysiological intensities and distresses that were very common in the sacred practices of our ancestors that we've lost a lot of contact with now. And my feeling, I sometimes call it the teratogenic mystique. There's something which means the becoming monstrous. Like what does the lure of the strange and the disturbing, what's required from that experience in order to undergo re-enchantment? So one of the knowledge sets, one of the skill sets that I think shamanoids who were trained and matured and networked in a contemporary world would be, how do we use disorientation and ordeal to help mature people and to help create a re-enchanted sacredness for the civilization that we exist in, given all of its faculties and all of its interesting scientific world spaces?
I've been sort of feeling into the conversation. I was sensing like can be also the shivers because I'm heating the room here with a wood stove and it hasn't been heated for the last day or something, so it's quite cold. And so I'm feeling like, is that it? Or am I just also tuning into what is going on? Yeah, it's probably both. I can't help but think that there is this, you have this, the magical universe and this plurality of realities in a sense, which are sort of, which were moving and interweaving, and yet these, almost like a conflict of realities between monarchs, between empires, and between the different cultures across continents, and that we now find ourselves sort of almost globally like congealed into like what feels like a almost singular reality, sort of, and almost like it's concretized of sorts. And in that, it feels very double because in it feels like the rules of reality are quite set, like the materialist frame is quite set, like how we interrupt or how we interact with reality and maybe interrupt reality is done on a material way. So the scientific rationalism, materialist worldview. While underlying quantum physics, of course, is this something else is bubbling there, like the concrete isn't solid. And I'm sensing into like, okay, it feels like we live in this concrete reality where things are as they are. While at the same time, it appears that most individuals actually live in completely separate realities. It's almost like there's this meta myth of materialism, but it keeps all this space open for personal myths or stories or how people relate to the world and what they feel. And that is all. And so I'm getting this image of like a, roots of a tree or things growing upwards, coming together in that sturdiness. But now we are open in all these tendrils of realities going different places. And the bounds appear to me to be this materialist framework. And if I'm if I feel into that, and I've read some things about idealism or maybe panentheism or these panpsychism, more these kind of concepts and experiences I've had in other states, I get the sense that reality is way more malleable than the materialist framing proposes. And that if you get a culture or a collective to inhabit, let's say, a worldview that's just outside of that, or and then there's open space for almost like miracles in a sense. And I'm feeling like, is that also not the function then of the shaman? More one of binding together, more of like synthesizing and bringing together into a concrete, or not again concretized, but into a common reality. And maybe that involves what Layman was also talking about, like this brief moments of intensity to nudge people out of certain realities. And then they have this experience of the liminal and of the very much uncomfortable, like what is actually happening here. And then the shaman can maybe play a role in shaping or tuning into other bounds or other, let's say, framings. And I remember talking to Layman about this, if we move from the material plane, let's say, like the reality that materialism proposes, like hard dualism, and you have on the opposite end, you have the complete non-dual, like the God space, let's say, where nothing is differentiated. There's quite a bit of space in between that. And there are, in different traditions, there are many different ideas of like, oh, this is the astral plane, or this is this plane, and here's this. And I was picturing it more like the ocean, and that you have zones within the ocean. And in some zones, the conditions are quite similar. And so the rules of interacting in that zone are this, this, and that. And the rules in that zone are this, this, and that. So they are different. And that the role of the shaman is maybe to take people from a certain depth or from a certain surface level, bring them down to another level, and then know the rules enough of that reality so it can sort of become more concrete, more realized. As multiple people are inhabiting the same reality, it becomes more real, as in, sort of tangible and physical reality. And then things seem to be able to snap into place. And my experience with healing work, with individuals and with groups, the bundling of attention is super important. And I don't need to prime with a whole metaphysics or with a whole words, what are the rules. It's mostly about aligning perception. It feels like perceptive awareness, and then feeling together into that larger sense of self or that larger space. And so people acclimatize more easily or quickly to that, and they move differently. So they're invited into different states of being. And I think that if the shaman in that role can hold a certain reality, a certain depth, then people can be helped or can be called into that. And the more people who are called into that, the more coherent it becomes. And for me, describing this already sounds to me like this is a way of how human perception interacts with reality and how it potentially shifts reality. And how far that goes, I don't know. I haven't read deeply into physics or metaphysics, but I think it can be way more profound than the current, let's say, materialist ethos describes. And I feel that the calling of the meta-shaman, or let's say that person, is really to aid in that stabilizing of a potential different reality.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of different potential subtypes or specialities within this group of people, assuming they are recognized and have some training and don't go crazy or get burned at the stake or anything like that. One of those functions that recurs throughout history and probably will continue to play an enormous role is that of healing both psychologically for the individual and collectively for the community. And those processes, the dynamic architectures of those will look very similar. They have to involve modifications of attention and perception. They have to be able to partially disembed a person from the patterns and the realities that they're already involved in, and make it easier for them to come to either a new open space in themselves or a new type of pattern that would be better for them, right? And that there's a little bit of flux there. It's an interesting thing. I've done some hypnotherapy training, right? And then there's one element of hypnosis where you're like, what you really want to do is take a person and help their brain deconstruct its relationship to a pattern they don't like and migrate to a pattern they do like. And that's a very important journey. It's a very important healing function. But there's also something very interesting for people who are intrigued by these states, which is, yeah, maybe we're not so interested in trying to get you to just be a non-smoker. Maybe we're interested in hanging out in this in-between state of consciousness and seeing what it has to tell us. Can we render it a little bit more coherent? What does it like to become more indigenous to these in-between states, to these unlocked threshold modes of being? Can we gain skill in that? And then when we gain that skill, how do we deploy it with ourselves and with others? And it'll look different in different contexts, and different people will be moved toward different kinds of specializations. There's a lot of talk about states of consciousness, or ontological pluralism is one way sometimes people describe it, because we do have this story, which is the materialist story. It's been very successful in some respects, and it might be even very appropriate for people who are technologically minded. And I don't just mean people who build machines, but people who are disposed to put their energy and their time and their service to the group into just doing things that are very straightforward and technical. And we need an enormous number of people to be committed to doing that very well. But that's obviously not the full range of possible realities as told to us by altered state experiences, as told to us by the edges of our own models of physics, as told to us by all of religious history. And then how do we think about these states? One of the classic ways in, let's say, pyramid cultures, where matter is at the bottom, and then life, and and then women, and then men, and then the king, and then God, and then an invisible thing that's even beyond God. There's this simple thing that escapes embodiment into abstraction. That kind of mode has traditionally looked at states as if there was the gross, the subtle, the causal, and the non-dual, and they were in a kind of value hierarchy. But I think the shamanic lens is more like these are several sets of types of realities that we can encounter. And your job as the maturing shamanic adept is to be in between those, to be capable of exploring all of those, and to be able to meet other people in whichever mode of reality they've gone into and try to be helpful, try to stabilize them, try to help them move perceptually toward more coherence, and disembed a little bit from whatever fixations or identifications have gotten them trapped in any of those modes of reality, so that they can unfold to the next more coherent stage of what they're doing. And I think there's an interesting element here as well. You know, we don't really know how our ancestors saw it, right? In terms of the monism or the pluralism of the universe. We do know that the large monotheistic religions, followed by secular modernity, have largely reinforced the notion of a single kind of homogeneous reality and a single kind of human being. But we're looking at a situation now, right, when we talk about how does all of this look at a planetary 21st century kind of scale, we're looking at a situation where the biosphere is becoming capable of getting off this planet, right? That sub-biospheres can be created, that enormous sets of powerful tools for creating diverse experiences of consciousness are being created, that genetic modification offers us the possibility to go way beyond this little question of transgender into the question of trans species, and that maybe not too far into the future, we're not looking at a human species, but a lot of human species, a lot of different kinds of worlds and realities that could unfold in different directions. So there may be a special role for the custodians or the gardeners who operate between worlds to play in a movement that's happening uniquely and historically at this technological moment, right? The becoming plural of the biosphere and of the species.
I'm immediately drawn then to the dynamic of that which resists becoming plural. What forces resist, like the hands that do I'm seeing clay, and that you sort of stretch the clay, and that it forces that want to keep it coherent in the form that it is. Because if you interact with people that are actively seeking altered states, either for their own sake, as in wanting to inhabit those altered states more and more and become practice themselves, or people who are seeking wholeness that know they are stuck in something, then it's super interesting to me to think about, well, what about the ones who don't know they are stuck in something, but are very much stuck, and to the detriment of the collective, maybe to the detriment of themselves as well. Like, what is the role of shamanism in that kind of interaction? And then maybe you then come more also into the terrain of, witchcraft, magic, or directed intention, or you can call it many things, but and how many?
That's the really open question that is often one doesn't want to enter it too quickly, which is, how real are other modes of agency? When we think about what the shaman does, we might say, well, these people are tending the synchronicity, imaginal, biospheric garden of the world. And if they weren't doing their work, the entire system would fall apart because it wouldn't be tended by magical operatives of some kind. Now, it's pretty easy to get carried away with that kind of notion. And often we hear ideas like that from the dumbest possible people. On the other hand, feels like there's something to it that's worth exploring. So that's a delicate topic. The question of the resistance is a really interesting one, right? And again, it's within us and in the collective. There's different reasons for resisting this developmental growth, this expansion into a kind of organic, plural cosmos. One is safety and trauma, right? A lot of people, it doesn't feel okay for them to go there. It's too strange. It's too dangerous. One world is bad enough, let alone a million worlds. They're not ready. And so they would need to be secured and healed and taught skills whereby they could be relatively secure agents in those worlds. Now, I think we also have to imagine that there are different specializations in the human population, that even though there is a traditional and normal role for shamanic input into human society that we've been neglecting as a global village, and maybe there's conditions now that are uniquely crying out for shamanic input. Nonetheless, not everyone is supposed to specialize in that kind of experience all the time. Most people don't want to hear about it. And maybe maybe once or twice a year at the holidays, or when they're going through an existential transformation or something like that, and the rest of the time they just need to forget about it. That's quite valuable. And then, of course, there are individuals and systems that have entrenched momentum and are benefiting to a ridiculous degree from the kind of system we already have, and they would be reluctant to admit any kind of transformation to this. But I think from the point of view of individuals who are shamanically sensitive, we feel that there is a suffering in all of that, that there is an unnecessary clenching and a resistance. And we have to be able to not only heal people and demonstrate that there is effectiveness in other modes of sense making and agency and intelligence, we also have to be able to demonstrate that it's It's a fun and interesting thing to do. That even if not everybody wants to do it, that it's not only fine, it's an important voice to have inputted into the strategic self-organization of the village at all scales. And that goes a little bit to creating a kind of revalorization of the shamanic caste, let's say. And I think a lot of the shamanoids today are not well, not embraced, not recognized, but also not skilled, not matured as human beings. And if we could secure them and train them and mature them, we would nonetheless still also have to arrange a situation where what they have to say, even if it sounds like gibberish, if they're trying to communicate from nonlinear elements of reality, where it's respected in the village, where you want that voice at your council, on your CEO board, in your administration. You want to hear these strange voices. And if we don't get that, we probably end up doing it in a fairly poor and clumsy fashion, right? I think we see, for example, in American politics, a tendency of the collective mind of the people to reach out for really strange, disorienting characters who look like they might be insane magicians capable of operating in a universe of chaotic multiple realities. And I think there might be something healthy to that impulse. And if they had better options, they might be able to choose better options. But in the absence of those options, they choose the worst possible version, so to speak. But they're crying out for someone to play that role. I think there is probably a role for a shamanic politics in some ways going forward as a species. So I'll pause there and we'll see from there if we want to go somewhere else or if we want to try to dive into the how real is magic question.
Curious, Tom, what you're sensing.
There was something in what you said earlier, Simon, of sort of like when materialism or physicalism is our consensus reality, what I was hearing was it's almost like there's this weird shadow that gets created where that pluralism then has to hide in our individuality in this maybe almost like a more schizophrenic way, because it's not finding its integration in the collective. And so, yeah, I'm hearing like a weird inversion that might be going on there versus maybe a culture that holds more of the virtual or the space of possibility in its ontology, or maybe even privileges that, like what kind of happens when we rearrange those pieces. And yeah, I'm sort of, there's this interesting tension where on the one hand, I'm kind of feeling like the shaman is this quite specific form of interior process. And maybe it's more like related to the many rather than the one. And it's sort of more about the imaginal than it is about the non-dual. And I was really resonating with what I felt you bringing in, Layman, about like, it's almost like we've got this plurality of imaginals kind of erupting, and that includes like going off world. And so we actually, like, we really need these people who aren't kind of wedded to the one, so that we can kind of safely go into the many to take seriously the possibilities that might be brewing there before, to kind of prevent a premature collapse back into some monism. And I was also feeling like what happened in the advent of Christianity, like when you kind of came out of this, like this more indigenous ecological pluralism and kind of snapped into something far more monistic, and then kind of like the role of science beyond that kind of stack of like the shamanic, the priestly, and then the kind of scientific, sort of weaving our way through that and popping out the other side, and then looking back. And yeah, it's like when we say meta-shaman, is shaman really just a placeholder for any word that reflects any kind of shamanoid? But like, is there kind of a nuance where once we weave through those like layers of consciousness and we arrive at the meta position, we then kind of have this choice to fold back and almost specialize as one of those shamanoid characters, and that will emphasize different layers in the multidimensional stack. Maybe.
Yeah, I think we are talking about whatever the shamanoids become, and that becoming, like with any other being, is not limited to something like the magical or the subtle domain, right? That we're talking about a way of going into the fullness of all the basic types of states, of being at the center of the mandala of all of those things, of having a lot of causal and a lot of non-dual and a lot of realistic material gross realm experience, and encountering something that weaves all of those together. And from the experience of that weaving, finding different specializations that occur in our manifest embodied forms, including all of its somatic and energetic and subtle and imaginal and also transcendental components. Finding ways where it's a little bit like, I don't know how familiar you are with the notion of the true will and sort of Aleister Crowley occultism kind of stuff, but there's these ways of thinking that suggest that there's a dynamic, unique version of illumination that's possible for everyone. And so shamanism to some degree speaks to that. But what it adds to a lot of those occult discourses about how you uniquely and authentically embody your transcendental illumination in a particular form is that it emphasizes several things that if we don't specify them, they often get left out. And I'll often talk about a shamanic turn within any of the wisdom traditions, because if we don't specify ecology, it can get left out, right? There's a difference between a bodhisattva in an urban monastery environment and a bodhisattva who is enriched by a knowledge of humanity's relationship to ecology. And as we look at the problem of the noosphere and the biosphere's relationship going forward, which is very much like the village and the wilderness relationship in archaic culture, we need our wisest people to be thinking about life and organism and complexity and place and land and things like that. So that's one element. The ecological mediation element is something we hope for from the shaman, as well as other forms of intelligence in the world that go outside of that of the individual conscious rational personality. So this is something that I think our ancestors periodically knew really well, but our wealth of knowledge and our sense of where the world has come to today really highlights the fact that the individual fantasy of being a single rational agent who can come up with solutions, we've more or less seen how far you can take that. There's ranges of problems it can handle, and there's ranges of problems it cannot handle, and those problems are accumulating. So we need to reach for other forms of intelligence that are symbiotic, that are collective, that are computational and ecological and subconscious. And really, I think a lot of this comes down to that particular idea, which is what does our social participation, our ecological participation, even our spiritual and transcendental participation look like if it's mediated through subconscious intelligence rather than through the conscious personality? But that's a subset of this general question of how do we bring in these other domains and ranges of intelligence that we might not even recognize as intelligence in the same way that we think of an individual personality as being intelligent. Now, any individual can and should be able to access the boundary of potential experience, the boundary of being, and to fold that back in a unique way. But what we need are a lot of well-trained, healthy, smart people who are doing that such that it also unfolds these other forms of intelligence that we need in order to collectively address problems that go outside the realm of the individual's mind.
Nice. For some reason, I'm getting the sort of the image of ants, of an ant colony, and how much of the individual ant, well, we can say conscious experience of being an ant and being in the colony, how much of that work it does. Does it know that it's doing, for instance, soil modification or it is doing nutrient redistribution, what the mass organism or the superorganism of the ant colony is actually doing, and what the plant is also doing, or the larger ecosystem around the superorganism. And then I'm feeling into like how much of the how do we orient ourselves indeed towards a healthy superorganismal behavior? Oh, Layman dropped. There he's back. Perfect. I was thinking about the you invoke the unconscious and the conscious aspects of it, and I found that very interesting to play around with how much is in the conscious mind and how much is in the unconscious mind, and how can the conscious mind often also trip up whatever process that has to happen unconsciously, that has to remain unconsciously. But there's also a skill of mastery, I think, in becoming conscious of unconscious processes, because then one can lean more into it or bring more focus to it or bring more awareness to it. And that's an art, I think. Maybe like the musician who is completely untrained but is massively charismatic and popular is like maybe a unconscious master and just does. But you can also have these ones who fully grasp it and master the craft. And maybe, I don't know if that amplifies whatever signal that they want to go for. But in bringing it back to the human as the collective, like how much of the subtle activity, but also like the gross activity of just being in the world and being active within the systems that we find ourselves in, like these organizations, these organs, how much of that needs to be brought into the conscious mind and then to be modified or to be shifted, and how much do we actually need to allow our unconscious awareness that is maybe active within other types of organizations, like these way more subtle interactions that can happen between people or in certain spaces that you craft, where dialogue goes interesting places, or where the liminals actually being opened, that you can step into this sort of collective, maybe multi-core processing of sorts, if we want to use computer terms. So I find that interesting. There's also another thought, and it's kind of slipping away from me. Maybe that one wants to stay unconscious.
Yeah, when I was a boy, I was tremendously fascinated by the Dada and Surrealist art movements in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, and their attempt to fold in the arbitrary and the random and the subconscious. And Surrealism was the sort of the French word for, we might really call it hyperreality or something. If you could combine conscious and unconscious intelligence, you could produce something that might be transformative and redemptive in a way that either of them on their own wouldn't really accomplish. So it's really interesting to think about not only how do we value and access subconscious intelligence, but what's the relationship between the two of them? And I normally think about consciousness as a kind of assistant to subconscious processes. Most of our processes are subconscious. Most of the things you aren't thinking about right now. Right, so you have this little window, but that little window has tremendous leverage, but it also has to envision itself the right way. It has to try to be a good assistant. Right? How can it retrieve impressions from the world and pass them into a subconscious sense-making system? And how can it receive the results of that and the impetus that comes out of that, and then help to act on that? How can the conscious mind, let's say, help the subconscious mind to grow and evolve and become more powerful and more intelligent? We hear a lot of people say that they trust their intuition or their gut instinct, but we don't hear them talk about why they think their gut instinct is intelligent or how they would make their intuition get better. So I think we can imagine maybe that the conscious mind is like a priest and the subconscious mind is like a deity of some kind. And it can like bring sacrifices to that deity and do that deity's bidding, but it also has a responsibility to try to make it be more informed and more engaged with the world, more up to date, more capable of really expressing itself. I think we see that in all kinds of interesting figures throughout history in all different areas. Like you were talking about these qualities of mastery, and sometimes mastery seems more like individuals trying to enforce, very often men, some kind of left brain control over the world. So they've got it all locked down. But other times, mastery really means how do I flow with things repeatedly and with increasing precision and responsibility to the point that I'm an instinctive participant in those domains and that something more than what I know begins to inform them. Right? When we think about this has been going through my head through this whole discussion is what are some interesting examples of shamans in different areas? We mentioned Jung. I would mention Chogyam Trungpa among contemporary Buddhists. I would mention Saint Francis among Christian saints. I would mention Salvador Dali among Western European artists, right? You find these people in different domains and they have a great deal of coherence in what they say, but they're very often talking about the organic and the mysterious and the subconscious, and the way they see their role is being a mediator or a bridge between the world and a form of potency that they cannot perfectly see or identify with, but to which they are devoted. But it's only worth being devoted to your subconscious intelligence if you really think it's smarter than you are. So the primary task is to help it get smarter than you. And I think that's a really interesting thing. We do see it in lots of forms of mysticism, but as a way of being in the world, as a way of sort of existentially operating as a citizen, it's very intriguing. Can we, and what would it take for us to make the mysterious part of ourselves be reliable enough that we could turn ourselves over to it and not be fools in the process, or be right kind of fools in that process?
I like that. Yeah, because that was indeed also the sort of sense of mastery I was pointing to, that maybe what the martial artist might bring into you have the meme of beware of the man who practiced the same kick a million times. Like being so fully aware in the entirety of the body, what it feels like to do that kick and deliver. And then it's more than just the body. It's like the whole energetic body and what it gets transferred in that. And so with that type of mastery, I'm thinking about, can you be fully submerged and fully sort of surrendering to whatever process is being moved through and is being called for that role in that movement within that, what your right place is in that space, while at the same time also bringing in the full awareness of observing what is going on. And then I'm getting the image of it more like becoming even more tangible instead of being just something that is fully taking over. I think there's often there's often a wish for the priest to step in and also to be present and to almost observe the actual magic, the actual thing that is happening. So that was coming up for me in the terms of mastery. Seem to be losing the thread there. It's interesting. I don't know why.
Yeah, it could just be French Christmas brain, or it could be that something in you other than you is stirring.
Yeah.
Because that's an interesting thing about shamanic discourse, which is that, and we can be doing it right now in terms of the way we frame it, are we just two people talking to each other, or are there two other people or three other people in this conversation that the speaking person is facilitating or trying to be helpful to?
Yes, excellent. Because now it came back as well. Is can we aid the unconscious also to become, let's say, more wise and skillful as what to pay attention to, how to orient, how to be present in the world? And that sparked immediately the thought for me about how we seem to operate currently in a quite toxic, I would say, informational ecosystem, as in there's a lot of signal jam, as in advertising and just random gibberish and overproduction of well, I would say not very important or coherent information. There might be a lot of signal in like different things, but at the same time, it's the overload, but also the toxicity of the biophysical, like just the amount of pollutants in the environment, the soil degradation, the food degrading. I'm thinking also more and more that if we think about our gut, we often then the talk is like we trust our instincts or our central nervous system around the gut, which is most likely older than the central nervous system within the skull. But what is older than that is the microbiome. And that is a pluralistic environment. That's like billions of individual cells, many different species that create highly complex food webs or metabolic webs that produce all these secondary metabolites, which the body needs. And seeing the inside, which is actually open to the outside. So the inside of our intestinal tract as an organ. And it is directly linked to the health of the soil microbiota. So our gut GI tract health is linked to the food that we eat from the soils. And there I think like, is it not more than just the three people or the six people in the conversation, but it's like the myriad of different people that can at any point come into presence and converse through us and speak into that space. And I find that practice is super interesting also to lean into that space of like, I don't know who's talking right now. And I find that very interesting myself to step into and make contact with. But that needs indeed that aid of, I think, the conscious self to also limit or create a sort of structure and protect the health of the physical organism as a tuning fork, but also the mental health, but also the mental ecosystem of what kind of maps are we attuned to? What things are we trained in? What kind of languages does the body crave? Does it crave the language as well of like different actual languages, but also scientific language, spiritual languages, maybe different ways of song or physical expressions, like all these different tools or ways of being, they aid, I think, that unconscious part. And even the normal experience of speaking, I mean, come on, I hardly know what I'm going to say. I'm not planning out my words as a presentation, so it's already like who is talking, like what is constantly shifting through, and of course I wish for, in general I aim for a cohesive ego structure or something that is perceiving and that is hopefully keeping it within certain bounds, but at the same time it's also like, yeah, can you allow for wiggle room for whatever other thing to step through and speak? And if we're talking also a bit about practicalities of modern shamanism, is it also not a very powerful and potentially very important function of the shamanoid or the practitioner to craft spaces where people are invited to speak as more than just their conditioned self, or the way the words that are often spoken within just the everyday. How let's say, I'm really again getting the image of ants, and I don't use that in any sense as something negative. I think ants are very interesting creatures and most likely highly complex. But the ants also communicate to one another with pheromones, and then there's a standard communication happening there. It's like the standard conversations on the day and in the normal job. They don't ask for what did you dream last night? Or can you invite whatever ancestor that's talking through you? Yeah, of course not. You're not going to do that at the coffee table at work. Or if you do, you have a very interesting workplace, and maybe I want to work there. But
Yeah, this brings up many things. First thing it brings up for me is maybe thinking about consciousness as the mouth. You're talking about the gut biome and that multiplicity that's in there. And it makes me think of many forms of digestion and communication, right? And I think one of the things we see the shaman do historically and still today is to take in different kinds of food, energetic, perceptual, conceptual food, and process them and have the return of some forms of prompts for action or consideration that might be unusual or abnormal or surprising. And so the mouth has to taste and chew, has to really chew up that food. And when it does, then it goes somewhere else. And the mouth doesn't get to know about that. But then periodically, the mouth also has to say things, and it doesn't know where those things were put together, where they came from. It has a very important role in allowing nutrient to pass to the rest of the system and also to express what the rest of the system has processed. I think that is a good metaphor for the relationship between conscious and subconscious intelligence. There's a sense in which one of the ways to think about the shaman, or whatever word would in the end turn out to be a better term for this, as a full spectrum spiritual human being of some kind, right? That we have these traditions of just being the material being. We have these traditions of trying to escape from the material being into elaborate states or into fantasies or something like that. But there are all these different functions, not only all the ones we associate with different forms of the brain, all the ones we associate with the different chakras, whatever sense we make of those terms, right? Our left and our right functions, our masculine and our feminine functions, our personal and our interpersonal functions. If we say that there's not only no reason why we should turn any of those against the others, but we should be good gardeners of all those functions, and that we should produce a species and a culture where in general people have fluency and health and strength in all of the functions and all of the perspectives and all of the intelligence of which an organism like ourselves is capable, then we have a way of saying what the shaman can do to help with the health of the civilization, which is to be experientially aware of the wealth of those different varieties of engagement and intelligence, and to then cultivate and call forth and meet that in other people so that we can move toward a rich, plural, thriving, but coherent system. And that requires an intelligent risk taking, because you have to open to complexity and diversity, but you then have to be able to assimilate it and turn it into a coherence of some kind. We don't want just a flat nihilistic relative multiplicity. That's not the goal. The shaman is supposed to be able to demonstrate the capacities by which the multiplicity becomes coherent. Now, language is really interesting here. I'm reminded of a time, Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, one of his comments about style was that it's making your own language stutter so that another language can be revealed from within it. I always loved that, right? And there's something about our words are always saying more than we know they're saying, and we don't know where they're coming from, and different lines of sense making are showing up. The surrealists that I mentioned were always trying to put words together in weird ways that gave you creepy feelings, like there was some kind of semantic too muchness in the phrase. But we also have the opportunity, I think, to um, try to get better at experiencing our language as a competency that says more and other than what it appears to be saying. Right? There's something you find in a great Zen koan, right? Which is a strange utterance that feels pregnant with a lot of potential, but it doesn't tell you what that potential is. You've got to really sit with it and work it to find that. There are kinds of gatherings that I sometimes have with people that we think of as being shamanic in some sense, where the discussion protocol for making decisions together is to not say what you mean, right? To try to, feel what you want to say, know what you want to communicate, and then say something else, right? And it comes out as poetic, comes out as peculiar, right? And I can continue to talk in a very sensible form, but what if I tried to talk about this as, as the effervescent tips of what some yellow egg could possibly do? And then you're like, is that sensible or not sensible communication? Is it some alternative sensibility of communication? Right? Imagine a workplace where people gathered around the table and had a half hour of that kind of communication. Would that allow their subconscious and organic intelligences to collaborate in a way other than the limited fashion that conscious verbal left brain communication typically allows? And would that produce different civilizational results?
What is coming in for you here, Tom? I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm stuck with the visceral feeling of that kick that you described, and that the kick that's been done a million times, and that kind of coupled with this image of the ocean that you described earlier on, and this kind of technological landscape that's sort of dancing light across the surface of that ocean in a way that's sort of perfectly distracting people from the fact that they can actually pierce through that and experience a depth dimension. And yeah, the many layers of kind of coherent and incoherent multiplicity that are sort of lurking down there, and the mouth is kind of sitting on the surface, and the shaman sort of being expert in sort of diving to different depths and looking for missing pieces and kind of sort of knowing how far down to go to find the pieces that might need to talk to each other, such that the people who are still sitting at the surface can kind of experience something new surfacing without really maybe needing to know so much how that came to be. And yeah, just that, like, what it feels like when the layers are all kind of aligned and speaking in a kind of chorus, that to me is that kick. And it's certainly not just a physical kick. It's a multi-dimensional kick. You're being kicked in all of those bodies in that moment. And it's interesting to think about, like, magic and the way it can sort of kick you without moving its leg. Like, there's a way the kinetic can kind of, also show up in these subtle forms. And that whole, like, art and realm being largely misunderstood or not presenced in the modern world. And yet there are these people doing that more or less consciously or unconsciously.
Lovely that you brought in again the ocean and what Layman just was talking about. I'm going to see if I can make sense of what is brewing. That the individual human is a multiplicity, is a myriad of things, of energies flowing through, of past, future, present, older expressions, newer things. And if I'm thinking about then what the role of the shaman is I think being aware of the different levels of reality that we intersect in, and as an organism, the different niches that we occupy across different realms. That the shaman is capable of traveling through and seeing the different realms, knowing them, but also integrating and establishing themselves in what is right for their individual being, their particular flavor. Because what Layman also talk about, like, yeah, we have some people who are most likely that they hardly want to be in the physical reality, and they are only in the sort of weird astral realms and just completely in imaginative space and doing that and channeling, and they have zero interest in doing gardening or doing any physical things, or maybe their body physically actually deteriorates because of this, because they are outside of their body so much. Well, we can also have people indeed on the opposite end of the axis who are just fully engrossed in the material, but in a sensuous way, and who are being fed and are feeding that realm as well. So I think taking an ecological perspective on this, it's like, how do we make sure health is, I think, coherence across all these different layers. And the role of the shaman is to be themselves as coherent as possible in those different layers, and having the let's say upscaled ability of being able to shift in those realms, so that they can inspect the individual, like, where are they not, where is actually the unhealthy part, where's the organism not established, where's the lack, where is there's a blockage, where is someone not growing their roots out into that layer, what is missing here. But also for culture, I'm getting constantly the image of this tree. Like, you have the magical reality with all the different individual cultures on the planet, Homo sapiens being hyper diversified in their myths and how they relate to the gods and their own set of pantheon and the nature spirits, going to the monomyths, and then to this hard sort of almost singular. So instead of the branched roots, you have the trunk, but from the trunk, then you get the branching again. And that maybe the role of the shaman is also to keep the health of the branching, that there is not a re-trunkification, let's say, that's a terrible word, but that there is this snapping, or this rupture of the things that the pluralism is like this rapid growth outward in all these different dimensions. But does this one know how to communicate with this one? Well, most likely they don't, but they don't have to if they are connected at least to the center in some way or form. And then maybe the role of the shaman is to be able to transmit nutrients, information from one end to the center and to the other one, or a team of multiple people who are capable of doing that constant communication, so that it doesn't happen that this arm of, and then a tree is a bad example, maybe it's more of like a slime mold or a other type of organism that might turn on itself, because you have in unicellular organisms that create biofilms, you can also have specialization, and you'll get cells that only produce fungal compounds or antimicrobial compounds, but hardly do anything else. So they get their metabolism from somewhere else. But if that one maybe starts misrecognizing what they're actually part of and starts producing enzymes against that, then the whole thing starts to collapse. So I think we probably, as moving forward, and it looks like we're branching out, there needs to be some form of return to the center as well, like this coherence, this return to like what is the collective doing? What are we part of? And then I get this image of, it's so important then that we are capable of entering these other realms to our best capacity. And if you are in that sense feel called to do that role, that you become aware of at what depth do you swim best, where are your sensors the most advanced, but don't never neglect all the other ecosystems that you also swim in, or the other layers of the ocean. A whale can go like, I don't know how many kilometers deep into the ocean, and it's expert at hunting at that depth. But it also surfaces. It also comes to the surface and it does something completely different there. So how do we navigate, or it becomes more about, I think, navigating that.
Yeah, three things come up for me. One is this role of what we might call the meta shaman. And one of the reasons why it's appropriate to this time period is because we just get to see and hear from so many types of human beings that we didn't before. You can imagine if you lived in a village and you were a shamanoid and there was one guy and he trained you a little bit, or you stayed with the witch at the edge of the village, whatever, that style was the only one you knew. You didn't get to sample thousands of styles. But we're in a situation now where we get to see that all of these different functions, all of these different plants have to be collectively gardened, and all of these specializations have to be encouraged. So I think that forces forth the role of the meta-shamanic individual, or the meta-shamanic lore, or some body of knowledge that could help coordinate all these different styles that maybe ancient lineages didn't have to deal with styles that were radically different than their own. What you're talking about, this alignment and this centering, I think is really important. And there's sometimes centering can sound very naive and positive and aspirational, like it would just be really nice to be at the center of things. But that, whatever that interface is between different modes and styles and functions, which can then deploy itself as helpfully coordinating all of them move relative to their own capacity and their own specialization, it's often at least peculiar and sometimes offensively problematic to us, right? To operate, to learn the skills of that in-between space can be disconcerting as a kind of parallax quality. You're not in either of them if you're going to be in there and gain that quality. It can also be antagonistic, right? As we know, between when two parts of ourselves feel, when they become active at the same time and don't agree with each other, or have different behavioral modules they want to run for us, to be able to hold them together, to remain in contact with both of them, is a kind of a friction. It's a kind of a suffering, right? We have to bear the discomfiture of being present between the strong energies of things that move into different forms of sense making, so that we can then be that in-between person and then help coordinate these things going forward. So it's not a matter of just finding the really nice space at the center. It's about being able to tolerate and to intentionally go into the very often the dilemma, the friction, the angst, the multiple poles that will come to bear upon whoever's trying to grow or become indigenous to that center condition. The other thing, Tom, you mentioned, magic in a way, and I think about the occult through this famous phrase by Hegel. Hegel said the mysteries of the ancient Egyptians were mysteries to the ancient Egyptians. And when I think about the occult, which just means hidden, or like knowledge that isn't known, right? There's one way to think about that where we say, oh, it's not known by most people, but a small group of people know this special knowledge. That's one way to think about the occult. But another way to think about it is those special people are the ones who are most aware of the fact that they don't know what it is, right? That the occult is a cult to itself, that it's a way of gaining capacity with not knowing. To what degree can mystery become a workable skill for you? And there are very simple ways to think about that. It doesn't have to be very elaborate. Anybody, you can go and say, here, put this rock in the right place, and just the world is just there. They have to find the right spot. Or you say to someone, I really love you to go out into the woods and bring me the right feather for the ritual. And they've got to go out there and they don't know, and there's no way to know. And they have to come back and say, I don't know why I chose this one, but I chose this one. And there's a kind of an exercising, there's a practice at a very basic level. It's possible for people whereby they can gain at least more comfort and potentially more skill in operating as unknowers rather than as knowers. And if we don't gain that capacity, then a whole range of reality's intelligence remains off limits for us.
Oh, and again, there's this tension coming up for me with the balance between the not knowing and the not knowing what you're doing and the knowing exactly what you're doing, and that there's this. I keep thinking back about also like the power that is in materialist, or that framing. Like if we can say one thing about the collective, but also the individual human, we wield a lot of power currently, and it's mostly thanked, I think, to wielding that framing of understanding levers, like causality, and I'm like. The right balancing between the not knowing, so one can tune into that. What flow that I can move in, and at the same time, it's also the knowing that you're in the flow and which direction it's going. And then, can you also swim, or can you also move or channel, or and there's this I don't know. For me, that constantly comes up, and there's also this. If you're only coming from knowing, and I think we all kind of understand what happens then it's just forcing, and that often doesn't work, especially if it comes to this kind of more subtle sensing. But there is this balance, or this dance between the knowing, like the post event rationalizing, like, oh, I picked this feather, and as I was walking back, why it's actually the best feather, it's because this, and this, because the magpie that dropped it is now flying there, and it's following us, and then all the language comes in, and then maybe that crafts something and enhances it. And so it's constantly that balance, and you can also do it completely wrong, right? There can be so much forcing of language over the mystery that just completely flattens it, or just makes it nothing. But there is space for the wordplay, the spellcraft, and I think spellcraft using words, I think that's one of the main magical traditions that is very, very much alive and active within the culture. I think there's so much spellcraft going on. How to do it well, or how to do it subtle and also more aligned and not forcing, because a lot of it feels forcing, right? Like the behaviorist techniques and the nudging and all this kind of stuff. So it's also like, what is modern spellcraft that is more aligned with, I don't know, what is healthy.
Yeah, I got a flash of a time. I'd been at the hot springs in Banff in the Rocky Mountains, and I came out of it and I came down this hill to the parking lot, and there was a cultural demonstration from a local indigenous group, and there were some beautiful dances. And then a guy started to speak, and he had a wonderful dress on, and he held up this eagle feather, and he held it up high, saying, "Eagle feather is very significant to my people." And I felt, yes. And then he said, "Because it represents farsightedness." And I thought, no, because he had shifted from something we all viscerally got to this encyclopedia of the meanings of the representational world. Now there's a role for that, but it just shifted out of the mode that I was most concerned about. So we have to get that balance right between knowing and articulating and doing, and not knowing and getting too trapped in the what I often think of as the social recapture of the sacred. It's very easy for things that have the strangeness and the potency of the sacred to get labeled as the sacred and suddenly lose that potency, right? A real ritual, to me, you should be like, I don't know what we're doing. As soon as you're like, oh, we're doing the ritual, then it's kind of dying already. A lot of what you're saying made me think about things like the will as well, right? There is a capacity for what seems to be an individual to take more creative and dynamic action in the world, right? And it's mediated by brain chemistry and the sophistication of your prefrontal cortex and all these sorts of things. But there is also this beautiful, ancient, magical, and metaphysical idea of the will. And as a kind of a capacity to be a good servant to something that we gain by extending an intention and struggling on behalf of an intention to bring it to manifestation. And we can be, following instructions someone else gave us, or we can be trying to live up to some ancient rules from a holy book. And those are both very interesting. There's lots of ways to struggle to try to embody an idea and gain a power that other people might call the will. But there's also these strange whispers that come into us from the in-between space of our minds, right? And great artists very often are responding to that. I feel like I want to sculpt some kind of snake thing out of that stone, right? And then 15 years goes by and she's still working on that thing, but there's a beauty to building a power of the individual that is an extension of these subtle and subterranean impulses, so that our production of agency as an individual is an extension of subconscious intelligences. The question of language in the contemporary environment is a really interesting one. Right? There's lots of tricks and techniques, right, in marketing or NLP or whatever it is. You're going to massage things, conversational hypnosis. It also seems to me that a lot of it is about using language to let something outside of language speak. And I think that's one of the interesting things I always find about American presidents, is that they frequently are saying shit that just sounds so crazy you can't believe it came out of anyone's mouth. And yet it allows them to rise to the highest echelons of power in the world. That there's something in the strangeness, the non-linearity, the apparent contradictoriness, the nonchalance they exhibit towards speech that is really impressive. So one thing you can do with speech and spellcraft, let's say, is to try to figure out how to organize a particular outcome. Another thing you can do is, can I just move it around so that it's constantly providing openings for something in myself that's prior to speech to extend itself through those gaps? And I think that's a very important aspect of spellcraft to look at, is just how does it leave doors open to what is willing a manifestation from out of your subconscious depths.
I was thinking about this tendency for any aspect to subtly try to move its way to the middle. And that's kind of why I feel this is like fundamentally a relational exercise, is to have that coherence. There has to be full participation. And it's not enough for one of the parts to kind of just say, I'm going to self-sacrifice, or I'm going to sort of be the thing in which this orbits around. There really has to be like a full showing up. And I feel like some facets have a capacity to bring that about in another part, whatever kind of level we're talking about here. But there's something about needing the full chorus online to actually get to that experience. And at different points in history, different parts kind of make their way to the center and begin exerting a kind of tyranny and try to restructure the world in a way where it becomes dependent on that part. And to bring back in the monstrous, I feel like the shaman is courageous enough, or perhaps even like enticed by that which is being cast out and maybe deemed as monstrous or ugly or even evil, and can kind of go to that in a kind of presence that is able to invite that part back into full participation. And I think that function of like stabilizing a culture by shadowing certain like flavors or qualities, the shaman becomes very adept in seeing that playing out. and knowing how to meet those parts in a way that can help them sort of be revitalized.
Yeah, and there's a tremendous necessity for love to be the driver of that, right? Whether the shaman is being imagined as the almost political go-between between ancient rival tribes, or whether it's the go-between the human familiar realm and the absolutely strange, unpredictable, terrifying nature of nature, or between our conscious selves and everything else that can be in us, or between any individual and what seems like the pathology or the sickness or the darkness or the madness of another person. The shaman has to be able to meet that and care for it enough that it can be opened up for recoordination with the rest of the inner team or the outer team. And that requires that they have a more than normal capacity for coherent emotional affirmation for something like love, to love everything about nature and love everything about human beings, and even to be, like you're saying, perhaps specially intrigued by things that seem grotesque and unlovable and strange, because the rejected elements have to find their place in order to make the full spectrum richness of a healthy system operate.
Yeah, I fully agree on that, and the importance of bringing in that capacity of love in interacting with, indeed, also the monstrous or the rejected, the exiled. For some reason, my mind went to the sanatoriums that were, think, built like at the late 19th century, maybe, or before the First World War. That was perhaps also like a politicization of outliers or of outcasts or different ways of being. And that is the medicalization is a sort of form of capture of the uncanny or the people who are, let's say, a bit off or a bit strange. How many schizophrenics in the West would be embedded in if they were embedded in a local cosmology that makes sense, where there are nature spirits around that talk to them, would be actually very, very coherent people, but are just outside of the context and outside of a bedding that makes sense. And then I'm also feeling then this is what was coming up for me, is like, we have a over medicalization, I think, of a lot of neurodivergence, and also like things like ADHD, but also like there's a lot of depression around, like the burnout, depression, like mental health is not doing well. And I also feel that there is potentially like an increase in also more like psychotic style behavior as reality fragments, let's say, and people are searching for coherence and cult-like behavior and all that kind of dynamics. That maybe also the role of the shaman is to pull it to the physical or to the everyday. It's finding, let's say, those aspects of people who are struggling and sort of bringing coherence in that as well, or finding a way of how does this, what is pathologized, how does that come back into a state of health? And what does that actually look like? And how do systems need to shift for this expression not to be a pathology, but to actually be a normal expression? It's the same like if a body feels pain, we pathologize pain, but it's like, no, what is causing the pain? Why it's in a position that creates pain? The pain is just the signal. It's not it's not something to be washed away. So for me, sort of getting at the end of, let's say, the set time for the conversation, I think it really comes down or a bit back to that. And also I feel that there's I'm liking it that we ended on, or that we are ending in this space on that, the importance of that heartfelt presence, that love, bringing that capacity to those aspects for a more full integration. And because if it doesn't include that, how are you gonna keep something together? you have to use glue and I don't know, like whips and all this other nonsense instead of like how do we actually want to be together again.
I saw a documentary some years ago about an Irish village that had all these strange stones on the beach, and it turned out that these stones were the fragments of the bones of the witches they'd burned centuries ago. And I remember watching it very clearly because I suddenly thought how strange it is that anybody would burn their witches. It's like they're your witches. Like, don't you think you're going to need your witches for something? Right. But that fundamentally is the difference in like we're going to assume that the variation serves a functional purpose, or we're going to try to exclude and remove the variation. But if we have that basic idea, which I think is the shamanic sensibility, that that neurodiversity is one example of a range of different sense making styles that if they were all healthy, we could harvest all of them to build a much more accurate picture of reality. So the question is not how to get rid of them because they're different. The question is how to stabilize those differences so that they can co-create a much richer picture, right? There's an external and an internal version of that. And a lot of that stabilization, I mean, there are roles for medicalization and pharmaceuticals and all that kind of stuff, but uh, ordeals and elemental practices, right? Your breathing and the way you relate to sunlight and water and nature and exercise and appropriate amounts of stress and relaxation and relational stabilization and all these sorts of things can bring a lot of people who have what look like mental illnesses into a condition where that's just an alternative style of doing human intelligence, and that the one of the roles of the shaman is to be sort of the gardener of all that. We don't want all the flowers to be the same in the garden. There are some basic principles that allow flowers to flourish, but what we need is a large variety of flourishing flowers so we can have a really good garden in this system.
Maybe just a final provocation or opening from me. Just thinking about like the Frankenstein, and with this kind of bottleneck that we're squeezing through, and this kind of even with like the work of Mike Levin and these kind of radical transformations in even morphological space, like how does the shaman relate to that which exists but is not coherent? And maybe that's just like a self-terminating question, but yeah, like is there a kind of is there a healing capacity that can work with something that has been sort of engineered, or is there a need for a kind of death process around that? I don't know. That's just, an interesting place to think about in the times that we're in.
That would be a beautiful place to pick up a next conversation. But I think one of the things we look to the shamanoids to provide are people who are both interested in and capable of touching incoherence and strangeness and even non-human quasi-intelligences of various kinds. And I think we're going to see more and more need for people who are interested in and good at doing that. Whatever the results of that engagement turns out to be, we need people to be making that engagement, and we need it to be the right kinds of people.
Excellent. Yeah, I want to echo that. That's a great provocation to end with as well, because it immediately just sparked some ideas for me and some images. So I'm just gonna chew on that for a while. Maybe get back to you on it.
Shall we land here then?
Yeah, seems good.
Yes, it's an endless conversation, and it's also already a long conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Layman. Thank you, Simon. This has been awesome.
Yeah, this was fun.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for holding this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting process this time around. I had a couple of times where I was really just flung out, just pulled out of it, and like, well, what now? I haven't had that many times. So interesting.
I'll take it as a good sign.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you, guys.
It's been very fun conversating with you both, and let's see what steers and comes from it.
Yeah, I'd be very open to doing more of this.
Excellent, guys. Well, wishing you all the best, and
Cheers,
enjoy
yeah.
the
Happy holidays.
day, the evening, the morning.